Imagine your morality screaming at you to stop, yet you keep going. The only reason? A confident voice told you to obey. This is the dark psychological paradox of the authority principle. So we're going to dissect this deep-seated, often unconscious drive we all have to just follow orders, even when they go against everything we believe in. You know, from the time we're kids, we're taught to listen. Listen to your parents, your teachers, people in uniforms. And look, it makes sense. It's how society functions, right? It's a building block of civilization. But that same conditioning creates this powerful mental shortcut. We start to automatically connect the symbols of authority, a title, a uniform, even just a confident tone of voice, with being correct. And that automatic trust, that's what makes us vulnerable. It's what allows us to hand over our own judgment, even when that little voice inside is screaming that something is very, very wrong. So how does this actually happen? It's really important to get this. This isn't about some character flaw. It's not about being a bad person. It's actually a feature of our mental wiring. Think about it. In this crazy complex world, you can't be an expert on everything. So deferring to a doctor or a pilot, that's an efficient shortcut that, usually keeps us safe. But here's the catch. That exact same system, the one designed to be efficient, has a dangerous loophole. It can be hijacked. It allows a person's own conscience, their moral compass, to be completely bypassed, replaced by whatever an outside voice tells them to do. All right, so in this explainer, we're going to take that loophole apart piece by piece. First, we'll look at the central paradox of obedience. Then, we'll uncover the surprisingly simple symbols people use to fake authority. We're going to dive deep into the core psychological trick called the Agentic Shift, and why we're so motivated to avoid responsibility. And then, most importantly, we'll talk about the tools you can use to switch your own conscience back on. And finally, we'll land on the one authority you should never ignore. Okay, let's start with the core conflict here. It's basically rules versus morality. Society needs rules, right? It needs structure. But what happens when a command from someone who seems like they're in charge directly clashes with your deepest moral beliefs? Well, that's the battleground. That's where this paradox of obedience really plays out. So yeah, this is the big one. This is the question that kept social psychologists up at night for decades, especially after the horrors of the 20th century. How could regular, good people take part in truly terrible things? Now, the easy answer is to just say, oh, they were all monsters. But the research points to something way more unsettling. It turns out that under the right conditions, pretty much anyone's moral compass can be temporarily shut off by the voice of authority. So how do you flip that moral switch? Well, the process doesn't start with logic or facts. It starts with simple symbols. See, our brains are what you'd call cognitive misers. They're built to save energy. Checking everyone's credentials from scratch all the time would be exhausting. So our brains rely on these simple visual shortcuts to decide who's credible. And as we're about to see, those shortcuts are dangerously easy to fake. The key thing to understand here is that the authority principle is really a compliance tactic. It's a rule in our heads where we just go along with people we perceive as experts. And in the process, we kind of stop thinking for ourselves. And that word, perceive, that's everything. It isn't about real expertise. It's about the appearance of it. This is what unlocks that kind of mindless compliance, whether it's a con artist in a fancy suit or the really chilling results from the Milgram experiments, where normal people followed orders from a scientist in a lab coat, even when they thought they were seriously hurting someone. And what's wild is just how basic these symbols are. First up, titles. Just putting doctor in front of a name makes people find a statement more credible, even if the so-called doctor knows nothing about the topic. Second, clothing. You've got experiments showing that people will obey a total stranger in a security guard uniform way more than the same person in street clothes. The uniform itself is doing all the talking. And third, you have trappings. The accessories of status. The fancy car, the office with all the plaques, the association with a big-name institution. Each one of those is a little shortcut that tells our brain, hey, this person's a big deal, you should probably listen. So let's be crystal clear about the goal here. When someone uses these symbols on purpose, they are trying to exploit our natural instinct to trust experts. They're not trying to win you over with a good argument. They're trying to get you to stop arguing, to stop thinking altogether. They want you to trust the lab coat, not the science, to trust the title, not the logic. The goal is simple: unquestioning obedience. Okay, so those symbols, they set the stage for the real psychological engine of obedience. This is where the magic trick happens, where your sense of responsibility gets seamlessly passed to someone else. It's a process that psychologist Stanley Milgram called the Agentic Shift. And it's a surprisingly simple two-step cycle. First, the authority figure signals that they're legitimate, using all those symbols we just talked about. That triggers an automatic assumption in our heads. This person knows what they're doing. Then, once that's established,
Step 2 gets triggered, the agentic shift. And in that moment, something incredible happens. The person stops seeing themselves as an individual who's responsible for their own actions. Instead, they start to see themselves as just an agent, an instrument for carrying out someone else's wishes.
This chart does a great job of showing the internal difference. Normally, you're in an autonomous state. You are the author of your actions. You feel responsible for them because your conscience is your guide. But in the agentic state, the whole thing flips. Here's an analogy. You're no longer driving the car. You've just slid over to the passenger seat and handed the keys to somebody else. And suddenly, they're responsible for where the car goes. Your neural compass gets put on mute and you're just following their directions. Your actions don't even feel like they're yours anymore. You're just a tool. And believe it or not, there's a strange and kind of terrifying comfort in that.
This phrase. This is the official motto of the agentic state. It has been used all throughout history to excuse actions that a person's own conscience never would have allowed. It's the proof, the verbal receipt, that responsibility has been transferred. The person saying these words truly believes they weren't in control. In their mind, the blame, the moral weight, it all belongs to the person who gave the order.
So, this begs a pretty big question. What is the deep down motivation that makes this shift happen? Why are we so willing sometimes to just hand over the keys to our own conscience? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple and deeply human.
The main driver is avoiding responsibility. The weight of our choices, especially the tough moral ones, can be crushing. The agentic shift is like a release valve for that pressure. It's a psychological get-out-of-jail-free card. The authority figure, either out loud or just by implication, is saying, "Don't worry, I'll take the heat. This is on me." And as Milgram's experiments proved, that promise is a way more powerful motivator for obedience than personality traits like how kind or empathetic a person is. This really brings us to the central mistake, the cognitive error at the very heart of this whole thing. You're faced with someone who is just radiating confidence, decked out in all the symbols of authority. Our brains are hardwired to react to that. So let me ask you, just straight up, is confidence the same thing as being correct? Is being high status the same as being high morality? Logically, of course not. We all know the answer is no. But our brains don't always run on logic. They run on what's practical, what's worked before, and they are wired with this dangerous little flaw that comes from our evolutionary past. See, for thousands of years, the most confident person in the group was probably the best hunter or leader. Trusting them was a good survival bet. But today, that ancient shortcut gets exploited constantly. We subconsciously mistake the performance of confidence for actual accuracy. We mistake the symbols of power for moral goodness. That is the glitch in the system.
Okay, so understanding the trap is step one. Now for the practical part. How do you defend against it? How do you turn your own conscience back up when an outside command is trying to turn it down? This isn't about becoming a cynic or just disobeying everyone. It's about becoming more aware. And there are actual mental steps you can take to get back in the driver's seat. Here are 3 key defense tactics. First, and this one is the most important, reestablish the agentic barrier. That just means consciously taking responsibility back. Second, challenge the trappings. Actively ask yourself, if this person said the exact same thing but was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, would I still believe them? You have to separate the message from the messenger. And third, get a second opinion. The power of an unethical authority depends on isolation. Just finding one other person who says, "Hey, does this seem weird to you?" can be enough to break the spell.
Let's just focus on that first one for a second, because it is by far the most powerful. This one single question, am I personally responsible for what happens next, is the circuit breaker. The second you ask it, you are literally grabbing responsibility back. You're taking the moral equation out of their hands and putting it back in yours. It forces your brain to shift from, "What are my orders?" to, "What is the right thing to do?" And that one question is often all it takes to snap out of the trance.
So, we've walked through the paradox of obedience, the symbols that kick it off, the mechanism of the agentic shift, and how to defend against it. And that brings us to our conclusion, the single most important idea to take away from all of this. Here's the fundamental truth. Obeying legitimate authority, it's a pillar of a working society. It's a mental shortcut that most of the time works out pretty well for us. But, and this is a huge but, that shortcut can never ever be a substitute for your own moral responsibility. There is a massive difference between taking the advice of a real expert and just blindly following an order because of the uniform someone is wearing. The first is smart, the second is a dangerous surrender of your conscience. So, let's recap the whole pattern. The authority principle can make us obey confident people even when they're completely wrong by forcing that agentic shift. The whole thing starts with symbols, a title, a uniform that create the illusion of legitimacy. That unlocks a psychological handoff, where you stop seeing yourself as responsible and become just an instrument for someone else, letting your own conscience get pushed aside. But awareness, just knowing this pattern exists, is the key to breaking the loop. By consciously reestablishing that barrier, by asking, "Am I responsible?" you take back your moral autonomy. You refuse to follow unethical orders, and you make it clear that your own judgment is non-negotiable.
Because in the end, titles can be faked, uniforms can be bought, and confidence? Well, confidence is often just a mask for someone who has no idea what they're doing. The only authority that is truly yours, the one that can never be silenced unless you let it be, is your own conscience. Trusting that is your ultimate defense.